don't think this is shared enough. And one of the things to keep in mind is that, yes, as mental health professionals, we've gone to school, we understand symptomology and diagnosing. But what I want you to know as the listener is that a lot of the times, and this is true for most programs, you do one trauma class your entire 2 years master's education level.
I think that one of the things that I love the most about your workbook is there was a section in there where you had people identify their triggers, the trigger and the response, and how our bodies were reacting to it. And that is super powerful. I think again, back with the disease model, we've been led to believe that things like anxiety are a disorder. And it took a long time for me to start recognizing when I had, and I finally got to a point like, oh, that's a trauma response. What happened that triggered a trauma response in me? But it was after a lot of work and a lot of healing, and I started recognizing stimulus and response, the things that were happening. Mm-hmm. And it didn't always make sense. I think that's one of the other things is that oftentimes the trigger is not a logical trigger. It's not like, oh, this thing happened because somebody yelled at me. And I remember my mom yelled at me when I was a child. And so my body had a reaction. For me, I had a numbing experience where I couldn't feel emotions talking to my daughter of all things. And I held shame around that experience for years and didn't tell anybody about it because I thought I'm like, there's something wrong with me. That is not normal for a mom to not be able to feel emotion towards her child. And when I finally was willing to talk to my therapist about it and work on it, we realized that it went back to abuse that I had experienced in my first marriage, which seemed totally unrelated. I'm like, how does that affect my relationship with my daughter? Right? Mm-hmm. So what in your experience, I think that's one of the biggest problems we have in trauma healing and that kind of thing is this barrier to understanding like what's actually happening to us.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up. And I was jotting down a couple of things that I wanted to touch on with this. And I want our listeners to know first and foremost, and I don't think this is shared enough. And one of the things to keep in mind is that, yes, as mental health professionals, we've gone to school, we understand symptomology and diagnosing. But what I want you to know as the listener is that a lot of the times, and this is true for most programs, you do one trauma class your entire 2 years master's education level. And then when you get out of school with your master's and you go into practice and you're seeing clients, a lot of the times, and at least this is how it is in this area, supervisors or people that you first work with, they're like, if anyone comes in with trauma, you need to pass that off to a more experienced clinician. Well, then how do we ever get experienced with working with trauma if we're always afraid to kind of like touch trauma or we think it's more advanced? And a lot of that just comes down to we don't know what we don't know because we didn't receive that education. So a lot of our education is around that diagnosing, how to use cognitive behavioral therapy and solution focused and maybe some other of those modalities. But there is a lack of education around trauma, and even more so for medical providers. Like, keep in mind that they do, I think, one trauma class for one semester in their whole medical career. And so when they're giving you a diagnosis, really be mindful of or ask, what experience do they have in the psychiatric realm? Because I see that misdiagnosing so much and it makes me crazy as a provider. Because one of the things that we know now about trauma is that trauma mimics so many other mental health disorders. The symptoms of trauma will show up like bipolar disorder. Really, if they're left untreated, it will literally look like bipolar disorder because you'll have a trigger like Michelle was just talking about. And maybe it leads you into this state of kind of dorsal depression, or you get flooded with this flight of kind of anxiety, and it can kind of appear like mania. It can look like major depressive disorder. It can look like generalized anxiety disorder. One of the ones that I hate personally that we label people with is borderline personality disorder, which is really just a trauma disorder if we really look at the origins of it. So keep in mind that a lot of the times, if trauma hasn't been screened and ruled out for you, explore that for yourself. That's so important. And it can take some of that stigma away. It can be overwhelming to have a trauma diagnosis, but there's healing with trauma. Your body has the ability, your brain has the ability to change and heal itself. And speaking of triggers, this is another misconception, right? A lot of the times when you go into counseling, we're like, tell me what your triggers are. And even if you were to ask me or Michelle that, we've done a lot of work, right? We might be able to list like a couple, like it would take a minute to think on them. But one of the misconceptions with this and within trauma and the neurobiology of how trauma is really stored is that trauma is not stored like a story narrative, right? It doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. Trauma is stored in your senses. So when you go through a negative experience, your body is doing this inventory, right? It's remembering everything that was said, everything you heard, the noises. It's remembering smells. It's remembering the physical sensations of maybe like where you were, the temperature. And it's going to store all of that sensory information in the 5 senses. And then maybe just one of those things in the future, like you smell, maybe like, I always use this example in trainings, like you get in a car accident, let's say, and then years later, you smell this like burning oil and instantly you start to feel your heart race and you're like, oh my gosh, why am I feeling anxious? This is so weird because you're not connecting. Like your brain is going, well, the last time we smelled, burning oil like this, we were almost in a state of like death or whatever it could have been, right? And so keep in mind that triggers oftentimes are sensory based. And so when you go through or experience that kind of startle response, whether you shut down, like Michelle said, you find yourself being anxious, do like a sensory inventory. Like, okay, what senses stood out to me? And that can help you start to kind of uncover or lead you to maybe what that actual trigger is and what it's connected to so that you can kind of do some work on that and resolve it.